The cold was a thief. It crept through the warped planks of the barn wall and stole the last of the feeling from her fingers. Anli pressed herself deeper into the hay, the sharp stalks pricking her skin through the thin, tattered fabric of her beige dress. Outside, the winter wind howled a mournful song across the mountain pass, a sound so lonely it seemed to come from inside her own chest. She was 21, but she felt ancient, worn down to bone and memory. Every shadow that danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the gloom was her father, his face a mask of cold fury. Every creak of the old wood was the sound of his footsteps approaching. She had been hiding for 2 days, the raw ache in her belly a constant, familiar companion. It was this hunger that had driven her out, away from the steaming laundry vats and the scent of lye, away from the man who called himself her father. A floorboard groaned overhead, a heavy, deliberate sound that was not the wind. Anli froze, her breath catching in her throat like a shard of ice. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the scrape of a heavy boot on the ladder leading down from the hayloft. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer forming on her lips, a prayer to ancestors she barely knew. The footsteps landed on the packed earth floor with a soft thud. A massive silhouette blotted out the moonlight from the open barn door. He was huge, a giant carved from mountain rock and winter shadow, his shoulders as wide as the doorframe he filled. Long, dark hair and a thick beard obscured his features, making him seem more like a force of nature than a man. He carried a lantern, and as he raised it, the warm, flickering light washed over her hiding place. His eyes, deep-set and serious, found hers in an instant. She didn't scream. The sound was frozen in her lungs. She simply stared, a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. He took a slow step forward, the lantern light illuminating the exhaustion etched onto her face, the grime on her dress, the trembling of her frame. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was a declaration, a claim to this space she had invaded. The world tilted, the shadows in the barn swirling into a vortex of cold and fear, and as he knelt down, his enormous hand reaching out not to strike, but perhaps to help, the last of her strength gave way, and she plunged into darkness. He lifted her as if she were a child's doll, a bundle of rags and bones that weighed almost nothing in his powerful arms. Thomas had lived on this mountain for a decade, and in that time he had grown accustomed to the company of silence and snow. He had seen bears, wolves, and the occasional lost prospector, but he had never found a person huddled in his barn, shivering on the edge of existence. He carried her out of the biting cold of the barn and into the dense, enveloping warmth of his cabin. The one-room structure was simple, built by his own hands, with a stone fireplace that crackled with a steady, life-giving heat. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth, her slight frame looking impossibly fragile against the dark fur. For a long moment he just looked at her, at the sharp angle of her cheekbones and the bluish tint of her lips. This was a trouble he had not invited, a complication in a life he had deliberately stripped of all complexity. Yet, turning her out into the snow was not a thought that crossed his mind. He moved with a quiet efficiency that belied his size, ladling broth from a pot simmering over the fire into a small wooden bowl. He knelt beside her and gently lifted her head. He had to pry her jaw open slightly, her muscles locked tight even in unconsciousness. He used the tip of a spoon to drip the warm, salty liquid onto her tongue, a little at a time, waiting for the instinct to swallow to take over. Her eyelids fluttered. Dark, almond-shaped eyes blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the firelight, the unfamiliar ceiling of rough-hewn logs, and the massive, bearded face hovering over her. Fear flared in them instantly, raw and primal. She tried to scramble away, a weak, desperate movement. "Easy now," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound was rough from disuse but held no malice. He set the bowl down and held up his empty hands, showing he meant no harm. "You're safe here. Just rest." He backed away, giving her space, and settled into a chair on the other side of the hearth, watching to make sure the life he had coaxed back into her did not flee again. For a full day she did not speak. She accepted the small portions of broth, and then, later, a thin porridge he offered, eating with a desperate, animal haste that spoke of a hunger that was weeks, not days, old. She watched his every move from the bearskin rug, her eyes wide and wary. Thomas went about his daily routines, tending the fire, checking his snares, oiling a rifle with methodical slowness, never pressing her, allowing the silence of the cabin to be her shield. He understood that some wounds were not visible, and that trust, once broken, was a hard thing to rebuild. On the second morning, as the pale winter sun cast long blue shadows across the snow outside, she finally found her voice. It was a whisper, fragile as a dried leaf. "An, she said, when he set a bowl of porridge beside her. He nodded, acknowledging her name. "Thomas." He sat in his chair, leaving the space between them unbreached. She ate slowly this time, her gaze fixed on the fire. When the bowl was empty, she hugged her knees to her chest, making herself small. "Thank you," she whispered to the flames. He waited. He knew there was more, a story coiled tight behind the fear in her eyes. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of burning pine. Then the words came, broken and halting, a confession dragged up from a place of deep pain. "My father," she began, her voice trembling so badly she had to stop and draw a ragged breath. He brought me here from the east, promised a new life." She looked at Thomas then, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He runs the laundry in Redemption. I worked, sunrise to sunset. The steam, the lie, it burns the skin." She held up her hands, showing him the raw, chapped skin. "He took all the money, for my food, my lodging," he said. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "He gave me scraps, barely enough to stand. He said a daughter's duty is to obey, to earn her keep." She paused, and the next words were delivered with a chilling finality. "My father starved me daily." The accusation hung in the warm air of the cabin, stark and ugly. She told him how she had finally run when she overheard him making a deal with a foreman from the silver mine, a cruel man with a reputation for breaking his workers. "He was selling my contract, my life." Thomas listened, his rugged face impassive, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. The quiet solitude of his mountain had been breached, not by a girl, but by the ugliness of the world below. He looked at An, a life force so dimmed it was almost extinguished, and the simple peace he had built for himself suddenly felt like a coward's refuge. The next morning Thomas rose before dawn. He moved with a new purpose, a grim resolve settling over him like the winter cold. He pulled on his heaviest coat, a thick buffalo hide that added to his already formidable size. He checked the load in his rifle, not with the intention of using it, but as a man checks his tools before a difficult job. An watched him from her place by the fire, her eyes filled with a new kind of fear. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "To town," he said, his voice flat. "To Redemption." "No," she pleaded, scrambling to her feet. "Please, he will hurt you. He will send the marshal." "Stay inside. Bolt the door. Don't open it for anyone." His tone left no room for argument. He saddled his horse, a powerful gray that was as accustomed to the mountain as he was, and rode out, leaving An alone with her terror and a flickering fire. The journey down the mountain was a descent into a world he had long ago abandoned. The clean, sharp air grew thicker, tasting of chimney smoke and civilization. Redemption was a typical frontier town, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, huddled against the vast, indifferent landscape. As Thomas rode down the main thoroughfare, people stopped to stare. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The mountain man was a legend, a story parents told their children. To see him here, in the flesh, was an event. He ignored the whispers and the pointed fingers, his gaze fixed on a small building at the end of the street, steam fogging its windows even in the bitter cold. A crudely painted sign read, "We Laundry." He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. The air around the building was heavy with the smell of soap and damp heat. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a humid hell of hissing steam and boiling vats. A small, wiry man with a severe face and eyes like chips of flint looked up from a ledger, his expression souring as Thomas's massive frame blocked the light from the door. "We are not open for another hour," Mr. Wee snapped in clipped English. Thomas closed the door behind him, plunging the room into a dim, steamy twilight. "I'm not a customer," Thomas said, his low voice cutting through the hiss of the vats. "I'm here about your daughter, An Lee." Mr. Wei's face, already pinched and severe, seemed to shrink further. A flicker of something, was it fear? Passed through his dark eyes before being replaced by a mask of indignant rage. He slammed the ledger shut. "My daughter is a thief and an ungrateful wretch," he spat, his voice sharp and brittle. "She ran away 2 nights ago after stealing from me. If you know where she is, you will tell me. She is my property, my responsibility." The words "my property" hung in the steam-filled air, heavy and obscene. Thomas took a slow step forward, his boots silent on the damp floorboards. He was not an aggressive man by nature, but a deep, cold anger was settling in his bones. He looked around the oppressive room, at the piles of dirty linen, at the harsh lye soap that had eaten away in An Lee's hands, at this cage her father had built for her. "She stole nothing," Thomas stated, his voice a low growl. "She fled for her life, a life you were selling to the silver mine." Mr. Wei's composure cracked. "Lies! All lies from a wicked girl's mouth. She was disobedient. She required discipline." "Is that what you call it? Discipline?" Thomas's voice dropped even lower, becoming something more dangerous. "Starving a child until she's nothing but bone and shadow?" The smaller man scoffed, trying to regain his footing with bluster. "Who are you to question how I raise my own daughter? A wild man from the mountains? You have no standing here. This is a family matter." "It stopped being a family matter when you stopped being a father," Thomas said, his gaze unwavering. He took another step, and now he stood directly before the counter that separated them. Mr. Wei had to crane his neck to look up at him. The sheer physical difference between them was a confrontation in itself. Thomas placed his hands, large and calloused, flat on the countertop. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I'm here for her wages," he said, the words falling like stones into the humid silence. Mr. Wei blinked, confused. "Wages? She is my daughter. She owes me her labor." "She worked for you for 5 years," Thomas continued, as if Mr. Wei hadn't spoken. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. I want half of every dollar this laundry has earned in that time. It belongs to her." For a moment, Mr. Wei was speechless. Then he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You are insane. Get out of my establishment before I call the marshal." "I can wait," Thomas said, his voice calm and unyielding. The threat was implicit. He was not leaving. Just as Mr. Wei opened his mouth to shout, the door swung open, and a man wearing a tarnished silver star on his vest stepped inside. Marshal Davis was a tall, lean man with a weary face who looked like he'd seen too much of human nature. "I heard shouting," the marshal said, his eyes moving from Mr. Wei's furious face to the mountain man's immense, immovable form. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Marshal Davis stood in the middle of the room, a pillar of weary authority between two opposing forces. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable, as Mr. Way launched into a tirade, accusing An Lee of theft and disobedience, and accusing Thomas of intimidation and lunacy. The marshal let him finish, then turned his calm, assessing gaze to Thomas. "And your side of the story?" he asked, his tone even. "The girl came to my cabin," Thomas said simply, "half starved, half frozen. She said her father was starving her and was going to sell her to the mining camp." "He is lying!" Mr. Way shrieked. "She is a liar!" The marshal held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Way, let him speak." He looked back at Thomas. "And you believe her?" "I believe what I saw," Thomas replied, "and I believe a man has a right to the sweat of his own brow. I'm here for her wages." Marshal Davis sighed, a long, tired sound. He ran a hand over his face. This was not a simple bar fight or a case of stolen horses. This was something messy, something that the law books in his office had no clean answer for. "Son," he said, his voice laced with a reluctant pragmatism, "I understand your sentiment. I truly do. But the law in this territory is clear. A daughter, until she is married or comes of age with her father's blessing, is his charge. Her labor belongs to him. There's no statute that says a father has to pay his own child wages." He was not being cruel. He was merely stating a fact. A cold, hard line drawn by men in a faraway capital. "So the law protects him?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It protects his right to starve her? To sell her?" "The law is complicated," the marshal admitted. "If you have proof he physically harmed her in a way that broke a specific statute, that's one thing. But being a strict father, withholding food as discipline, that's a gray area. As for her contract, he has the right to apprentice her out. It's his decision." Mr. Way smirked, a triumphant, ugly expression. The law was his shield. "You hear that, mountain man? The law is on my side. Now get out." Thomas didn't look at Mr. Way. His eyes were locked on the marshal. It was a silent challenge, a question being asked that went far beyond the dusty pages of any law book. What happens when the law is wrong? What does a good man do then? The entire town, it seemed, was now aware of the confrontation. Faces were pressed against the steamy windows of the laundry, their breath making little circles of clarity in the fog. They were watching, waiting. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice resonating with a certainty that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "A man who starves his own flesh and blood ain't a father," he declared, his words slow and deliberate, meant for the marshal but heard by everyone peering through the glass. "He's a monster, and his property is forfeit." That was it. That was the moment that would be retold in the town of Redemption for years to come. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a moral declaration. It was a rejection of the marshal's law in favor of a higher, simpler one. Thomas was drawing a new line, not in the dust of the street, but in the conscience of the town itself. The marshal's weary expression tightened. He was a man of the law, a man of order. This mountain man was threatening to unravel the very fabric of that order with nothing more than a conviction. "You are on a dangerous path," Marshal Davis warned, his voice low. "I cannot let you take the law into your own hands." "I'm not taking the law," Thomas countered, his gaze as steady as the mountain he called home. "I'm asking for justice. There's a difference. And if the law won't provide it, then men have to." He turned his back on the sputtering Mr. Way and the conflicted marshal. He walked to the door, his movements unhurried. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at the lawman. "I'm not leaving town, and this isn't over." He stepped out into the cold street, the crowd of onlookers parting before him as if he were a prophet or a king. He swung himself onto his horse and, without a backward glance, began the slow ride back up the mountain. He had won no money. He had secured no legal victory. but he had planted a seed of doubt in the heart of redemption. He had forced every person who witnessed the exchange to ask themselves a simple question. What is the difference between what is legal and what is right? And what do you do when you are forced to choose between them? The marshal watched him go, a deep unease settling in his gut. The law was his guide, his map through the chaos of the frontier. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like the map might be leading him in the wrong direction. When Thomas reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and purple. He found An Lee pacing back and forth, a small, frantic ghost in the dimming light. The moment she saw him, she ran to him, her relief so palpable it was a physical force. "You came back," she breathed. "I was so afraid." "I said I would," he answered, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a welcome embrace. He saw the fear still lingering in her eyes, the worry that his actions had only made her situation worse. He had faced down her father and the law, but now he faced a more difficult task, calming the fears of the woman he had sworn to protect. He didn't offer grand promises or declarations. Instead, he took off his heavy coat and began to prepare a meal. He worked with a quiet focus, slicing venison and root vegetables into the iron pot that hung over the fire. His movements were steady and reassuring, a silent promise of normalcy, of safety. An Lee sat on the bearskin rug watching him. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "I spoke to your father," he said, not turning from his task, "and to the marshal." "He will come for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The marshal said the law is on his side." Thomas finally stopped and turned to face her. He knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. The firelight danced in their depths, revealing a profound sincerity. "There are other laws, An Lee. Laws of decency, of right and wrong. They are older and stronger than any words written in a book." He didn't tell her she had nothing to fear. That would have been a lie. Instead, he offered a different kind of comfort. "You are not alone in this any more," he said. The simple words were a balm on her wounded spirit. For her entire life she had been alone, a solitary figure struggling against a tide of cruelty and indifference. Now this quiet giant of a man was standing with her, a bulwark against the storm. As the stew simmered, filling the small cabin with a rich, savory aroma, a fragile peace settled between them. They ate in comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding growing stronger with every shared glance. Later, as she prepared to sleep, he placed another thick fur blanket over her. His large, calloused hand brushed against her shoulder, a touch so brief and gentle it was barely there. Yet it sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time in her life she had felt the touch of another person without fear. It was the first time she had felt truly safe. The town of redemption simmered. Thomas's moral challenge had unsettled the community's quiet acceptance of how things were. Mr. Way, feeling his authority questioned and his reputation tarnished, fought back with the only weapons he had, ink and paper. He had posters printed and nailed to every available surface, on the general store, the saloon, even the church notice board. They described An Lee in cruel, sharp terms, a disobedient, thieving runaway, and offered a $20 reward for her return. The posters had an effect, but perhaps not the one Mr. Way intended. Instead of turning the town against An Lee, they forced people to talk. They debated in the saloon over whiskey and in the general store over sacks of flour. They remembered seeing the girl, always so quiet and thin, her hands raw from the laundry's harsh chemicals. They recalled Mr. Way's cold demeanor, his lack of community involvement, his general air of miserly contempt. The posters made her real, her plight a public question. Marshal Davis found himself caught in the middle. Men from the mining camp, enticed by the reward money, came to his office asking for permission to form a posse. He sent them away, but he knew he couldn't hold them off forever. His duty was to uphold the law, and the law, however distasteful, was on Mr. Way's side. Torn, he made a decision. He rode up the mountain alone, his horse struggling through the deepening snow. He found Thomas chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the vast white silence. Thomas stopped when he saw him, resting the axe on the chopping block. "Marshal," he said, his tone neutral. "Came to warn you," Davis said, not dismounting. "Way's put a bounty on her head. $20. It's drawing the wrong kind of attention. Men are talking about coming up here to collect." Thomas's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened on the axe handle. "Let 'em come." "That's not a solution," the marshal countered, his frustration evident. "This will end in bloodshed, and I'll have to be the one to arrest you for it. Don't you see? You've made your point, but you can't win this. The law is the law." "Then the law is an ass," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I'm not asking you to break it, Marshal. I'm asking you to be a man and see what's right in front of you." He looked past the marshal, his gaze directed at the cabin, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. "There's a young woman in there who's been beaten down her whole life. For the first time, she's safe. She's warm. She's eating a full meal. If your law says that's wrong, then your law can go to hell." The marshal had no answer to that. He looked at the cabin, then back at the immovable man before him. He was trying to enforce the rules of a game that the mountain man refused to play. He turned his horse around. "I'm telling you as a courtesy, Thomas. Be ready. Trouble is coming." As he rode away, Marshal Davis felt the cold weight of his badge, a symbol of a justice that was proving to be hollow. A quiet rhythm settled in the small cabin, a gentle domesticity that was new to them both. The conflict brewing in the town below felt a world away, insulated by the silent, snow-laden pines. Thomas and An Lee fell into a routine dictated by the sun and the seasons. He would hunt and chop wood. She would tend the fire and learn to cook meals that were nourishing, not just for survival. He never tried to teach her the hard skills of mountain life. He simply shared his world with her. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits in the fresh snow, not for the purpose of the hunt, but to understand the secret lives of the forest creatures. She would listen, her attention rapt, a small smile finally reaching her eyes. Her healing was a slow, quiet bloom. The gaunt look on her face softened as regular meals filled her out. The constant fear in her eyes was gradually replaced by a watchful calm. One day, Thomas returned from a trip to a distant trading post, a journey he made carefully, avoiding redemption, and placed a small parcel in her hands. Inside was a dress of dark blue wool, simple and sturdy, but clean and whole. It was a world away from the tattered beige rags she had arrived in. She held it to her chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Wearing it, she looked less like a fugitive and more like the young woman she was meant to be. That evening they sat before the fire, the silence between them no longer a shield, but a shared space of comfort. He was cleaning his rifle, his large hands surprisingly deft. She watched the firelight play over his scarred knuckles and the strong lines of his forearms. She saw not the intimidating giant from the barn, but the man who had patiently dripped broth onto her tongue, the man who had stood up to the law for her, the man who had bought her a new dress. Hesitantly, she reached out and laid her small, delicate hand over his. He froze, his work stopping instantly. Her touch was light, a question. He slowly turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, enveloping her hand in his warmth and strength. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that simple, profound gesture, a new understanding was forged. It was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a future she had never dared to imagine. She leaned her head against his powerful shoulder, closing her eyes, and for the first time since leaving her homeland, An Lee felt she was finally home. The breaking point arrived with the morning sun, sharp and bright on a new layer of snow. A rider from a neighboring homestead, a friend of Thomas's, brought word. The men from the mining camp, fueled by whiskey and greed, were gathering. They planned to ride up the mountain at midday to claim Mr. Way's bounty. Marshal Davis had tried to stop them, but his authority was limited. Thomas knew the time for waiting was over. He looked at An Lee, who had overheard the news, her face pale with renewed fear. "It is time to finish this," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I will not have you live in hiding, looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." "What will you do?" she whispered. "We will go to town," he said, "together." Her eyes widened in terror. "No, they will take me." "No one will take you," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "You are not the same girl who hid in my barn. Look at yourself. You are strong. Your father's power over you was built on your fear and isolation. We will take that away from him." He was right. She looked at her hands, no longer raw and chapped, but clean and capable. She felt the warmth of the wool dress against her skin. She felt the strength of the food he had fed her, the courage he had instilled in her. She made her choice. She would not hide any more. They rode down the mountain together, not as a protector and his ward, but as partners. When they entered Redemption's main street, a hush fell over the town. People came out of the stores and the saloon to watch. They saw the mountain man, as imposing as ever, but they also saw the girl. She wasn't the wretched runaway from the posters. She was a poised young woman, her back straight, her expression determined. She rode beside Thomas with a quiet dignity that silenced all whispers. They stopped in front of the laundry, where Mr. Way stood with the small group of miners, their faces a mixture of greed and uncertainty. Marshal Davis was there too, his hand resting on his pistol, his face grim. "She is mine," Mr. Way shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "The reward is yours if you take her." But before any of the miners could move, An Lee spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with a shocking clarity in the cold, still air. "I am not yours," she said, looking directly at her father. "My life is my own." She then turned to the townspeople, her gaze sweeping over them. "This man," she said, her voice steady, "used me as a slave. He starved me and would have sold me. Is this the justice of this town?" The miners shuffled their feet, their bluster gone, unable to meet her gaze. The townspeople looked at one another, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shame. They had seen the truth in her eyes. Marshal Davis stepped forward. He looked at Mr. Way's sputtering face, at An Lee's quiet strength, and at the faces of his community. He had a choice to make, law or justice. He made it. "There is no reward," the marshal announced, his voice ringing with finality, "and there is no contract." He turned to Mr. Way. "By the authority of this township and as a matter of public decency, I am declaring your guardianship of this woman null and void. She is a free citizen of Redemption." He then pointed down the road. "I suggest you pack your things, Mr. Way. Your business here is concluded." Mr. Way stared, dumbfounded, as the town turned its collective back on him. Defeated, he scurried back into his shop. Thomas and An Lee watched him go, then turned their horses and began the ride back up the mountain, leaving the town of Redemption to contemplate the lesson it had just learned. They rode into a future they would build together, under a wide open sky, guided not by broken laws, but by the quiet strength of the human heart. And as we watch them go, we have to ask ourselves, don't we? How many laws do we follow out of habit, and how many injustices do we ignore because it's easier? Maybe true courage isn't about facing down a gunman, but about having the strength to stand up and say simply, "This is not right." Let me know in the comments what you would have done. And if you're ever in a small town in the high country, look for the descendants of a quiet mountain man and a strong, resilient woman. Their story is a reminder that the most powerful laws are the ones we write on our own souls.